In the early years of settlement, the English treated settlers from other European countries with at best condescension and at worst exploitative brutality. Englishmen seemed to regard their colonies as exclusively English. While the English distinguished themselves from other peoples, they also distinguished among those different peoples who failed to be English. They viewed everyone with suspicion and seemed to have particular contempt for the Irish. Even during a time period when it was seeking to encourage European indentured labor, Virginia assigned Irish servants with longer terms than other Europeans. As time went on, however, Englishmen realized that their settlements in America were not going to remain exclusively English. In 1671, Virginia began encouraging the naturalization, that is, the making of legal citizens, of other European peoples in the colonies. Maryland achieved that same end with private naturalization laws that included the French, Swiss, Swedes, and others. The necessity of creating, maintaining, and expanding the population of the colonies transformed the English long-standing practice of discriminating among non-English Europeans into a luxury the English could no longer afford. Because as much as they grudgingly realized that other Europeans would make up a significant presence in the colonies, they also realized the need for a constant and perpetual labor supply. The English didn't give up their sense of distance, their sense that they were better than other Europeans. They continued to hate, for example, the Catholicism of the Irish and practice some discrimination among them. But they never and would never, no matter how much they detested these other European peoples they saw as different from themselves, they would never make slaves of them. Even those captured as prisoners of European wars, and these prisoners of wars were sent to Barbados and often treated brutally, they were never treated as slaves. And here, of course, is the difference. The English viewed other Europeans as like them, perhaps not as good, but like them. Africans, in the view of the English, were not like them. What they were was not initially fully defined, but it's clear that this difference allowed the English to try to define this status as conditions changed. Well, Native Americans, in the eyes of the English, were also different. English attempts to enslave Native American peoples proved generally unsuccessful. Uh, Native Americans had a lack of resistance to European diseases. They also resisted the settled and regimented agricultural work that the English tried to impose upon them. Also, the English depended upon Native Americans during the early years of settlement for their physical survival. The English traded for food with Native Americans. They formed alliances with them against other Native American peoples. Native Americans also retained their ability to escape from the communities of the English as well. So really, from the very beginning of settlement, Native Americans couldn't just be viewed as individual laborers, but as part of tribes, of nations, with which the English had to maintain, if not cordial relations, at least not openly hostile ones. Native Americans could and did mount numerous attacks against the English, and so they had to be seen by the English as people against which power and diplomacy had to be used. At a distance, Native Americans retained the quality of nationality. There were few pressures forcing the English to treat Native Americans as a part of their own societies. Initially, African slaves had to be dealt with as individuals rather than as members of African nations. African slaves were a part of English colonial societies, whether the English liked it or not. And under the conditions of colonial America, The specific African national origins of slaves tended to fade away in the eyes of the English. So the picture that is developing here is that Native Americans and Africans come to represent polar opposites in the minds of English settlers' views of so-called primitive people. Native Americans became a symbol of their American experience. They had to be allied with, fought with, conquered to tame what the English saw as the wilderness that was North America. Their view of Africans, however, was very different. Africans were not primitives that had to be conquered, but in the eyes of the English, Africans were primitives that could be exploited. But how does slavery develop into a racialized and racist system of labor? Before confronting Africans in Africa or America, most English probably had negative preconceived notions of the color black and ideas of blackness. The color black signified things dark, sinister, evil, and foul, while the color white suggested purity and virtue. Most Africans the English encountered were not just darker than they were, as Mediterranean people were also darker than the English, but Africans were among the darkest people of the world, and to the English looked odd with customs that were strange to the British. One early explanation for the differences in color was climate. Africans, thought the English, were darker simply because of the tropical climates they tended to live in. By the late 16th century, however, people began to notice that Africans removed from these areas did not become lighter, nor did Englishmen who lived in tropical areas for a particular time. They never got nearly as dark as Africans. Also, other people living near the equator didn't appear to be as dark as Africans. By the late 17th and early 18th century, these type of climate explanations were pretty much disputed and had fallen out of favor. There was another explanation that would have a greater impact and last for centuries in America. Some writers thought that God's curse on Ham, or really upon his son Canaan, and their descendants was entirely a sufficient explanation to account for the color of Africans. In the original story, Genesis 9 and 10, after the flood, Ham had looked upon his father's, Noah's, nakedness as he lay drunk in his tent. The other two sons, Shem and Japheth, covered Noah without looking at him. When Noah woke up, he cursed Canaan, son of Ham, saying that he would be a servant unto his brothers. Now, the question you're probably asking yourself right now is, why does this story, which seemed to kind of imply slavery and has nothing to do with skin color, become a popular explanation for the blackness of Africans? Historians aren't entirely sure, but certainly Ethiopians had been enslaved by Europeans since ancient times. The term Ham originally implied both dark and hot, and it isn't entirely clear that the religious writers of the time drew this connection, but it's likely that some combination of ancient European experience with Ethiopian slavery, the connotation, the one of the meanings of this word Ham, and revived Christian interest in a variety of religious writings during the late medieval and Renaissance periods gives us some way of explaining how this story about what seems to be slavery comes to be accepted as an explanation for the dark skin of Africans. Now, another apparent difference to the English was that Africans were not only unchristian, but seemingly without any religion at all. Now, again, remember this all takes place on the level of perception. As I've already discussed, in many ways, the worlds of Africans and English at base had shared beliefs in the power of magic and witchcraft and um, otherworldly phenomenon. In the eyes of the British, however, these similarities did not exist. To them, Africans were heathens. Now, in a sense, heathenism was less of a problem for English Christians than an exercise in self definition. The English defined themselves as proper Christians by establishing those people who weren't. In another sense, the presence of heathens in the world meant there was a lot of converting that had to be done. Now, these two things, like defining yourself as Christian against those you see as not, and the conversion mission of Christianity, aren't necessarily compatible. Look at it this way. If you are an Englishman who defines his Christianity in some ways by looking at those who aren't, how do you convert those people, in this case Africans, and still maintain your sense of difference? If Africans can be converted, that must mean that they really aren't that much different from you, if they're different at all. This contradiction might help explain the really haphazard way Christianity was introduced to African slaves in the colonies. Some thought it was dangerous, some thought it was a necessity, and still others thought it was useless. In the early years of settlement, Englishmen most frequently contrasted themselves with Africans by the term Christian. To be Christian was to be civilized rather than barbaric, English rather than African, white rather than black. Still, by the end of the 1600s, what that difference actually meant in terms of the definitive status of Africans was not clear. This condition was made more clear with the passing of the first law legally establishing slavery in Virginia in 1660. Clearly, this law made formal what probably had been in practice since 1640. That is, some, not all, some Africans were being held in perpetual and hereditary lifetime servitude. That is, some Africans were being held as slaves for their entire lives and passing on that status onto their children. What was becoming clear was that as the English increasingly depended upon African laborers, as the numbers of Africans increased, and in some cases dominated local populations, as Africans resisted their enslavement, and as Africans occasionally, but consistently and continuously attempted to use European social and legal practices to claim rights, it was clear that Englishmen had to further define what slavery meant. The slave codes that emerged during the end of the 1600s and the first half of the 1700s in all of the southern colonies and some of the northern colonies provide this definition. Slaves, for example, were forbidden from walking off plantations without a ticket from their owner or overseer. They weren't allowed to congregate in large numbers or carry clubs or arms or strike a white person. Slaves committing felonies were tried in specially constituted courts, which typically consisted of a justice of the peace and other slave owners. These were only a few of the slave codes. So by the middle of the 18th century, the 1700s, the system of slavery that would last for another century was in place. But there's another way to look at the slave codes. These laws, of course, weren't really written for blacks, for the African slaves. Principally, these laws told slave owners what to do, what they could and couldn't allow. It was white men who were required to punish runaways, prevent large grouping of slaves, to enforce curfews, sit on special courts. The maintenance of slavery depended on the mass consent among the white population, on widespread agreement that every master had to maintain effective control. Well, what does this mean? Well, in a sense, The slave codes are a public dialogue among masters and white men in general, which confirm their sense of mastery over their black slaves. It is a conversation in which white men are drawing the racial lines increasingly more distinct. Over time, the term Christian in these laws is replaced by the term English, which is ultimately replaced by the term white. In a way, these laws are central to the formation of a cohesive white community in which all are involved in the maintenance of the slave system. The actions of African slaves could only be controlled and regulated only as much as whites, rich and poor, slaveholder and non-slaveholder, could see their interests as racial interests, not class interests, not religious interests, not national interests, but as racial interests. Now, these interests are probably best reflected in the way the laws come to be justified. Over time, these justifications become more and more explicitly racist. Racial difference had defined Africans as different and less than English. What that meant, however, was defined over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. Slavery for virtually all Africans became perpetual and hereditary. So, was racial prejudice against Africans the main reason slavery began? Or did the enslavement of Africans come about for economic reasons? And did the condition of slavery then lead to racial prejudice against those who were enslaved? One historian has claimed that enslaving Africans was, quote, an unthinking decision. Slavery and prejudice may have been equally cause and effect, continuously reacting upon each other, dynamically joining hands to hustle blacks down the road to complete degradation.